Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you like this episode, please remember to hit the like button and leave a comment or two, then subscribe and click on the bell to receive notifications of whenever we release new videos. Also, please remember to share them to your social media. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the wilderness just north of Columbia Falls, Montana. The terrain of this area features valleys at around 3,500 feet in elevation, with nearby hills reaching near the mile-high mark of 4,500 to 5,000 feet. The Trumbull Canyon Road is an excellent jumping-off spot for anyone wanting to get into the more remote areas for hunting, hiking, or general adventuring. In this area, there are nearly uninterrupted forests of pine and fir trees that stretch for miles. Along the creek bottoms, willow and alder bushes screen and shelter the white-tailed deer, elk, and moose that sneak amongst them. The berries offering up their fruit to human and animal visitors include huckleberry, thimbleberry, chokecherry, and gooseberry. Patches of stinging nettle, nodding onion, and mountain sorrel decorate the ground with their beautiful flowers and add variety to the visual cornucopia. The dominant predators of the area include cougars, wolves, coyotes, and black bears, but the topic of our episode today is the powerful brown bears of the area. On the morning of November 11th, 2018, Anders Broste was teaching a friend, Dan Hansen, to hunt elk and deer. The men had pushed their way through a few inches of snow early in the morning when they approached a very thick, tangled stand of brush. The branches of the leafless underbrush tugged at Anders' clothes and his rifle as he fought his way through it. His visibility was very limited, and he couldn't do anything about the noise of the bushes rustling against his clothes and other branches as he forced his way through. Hansen was about 150 yards away from him, filming as Anders navigated his route. As he parted the brush with effort, he looked up and noticed a big bear head rising up before him from behind a log. He immediately recognized the dish-faced profile of a grizzly bear, and he was filled with terror as he realized he had its focused attention. The bear was a mere 15 yards from him and spun quickly to face the surprise interruption to its slumber. 36-year-old Anders moved to his home he shared with his wife Annika on Trumbull Canyon Road after the two had wed, and he accepted a job at Applied Materials selling specialized bikes around the world. He's always been drawn to the mountains and even rearranged his life so that he could be where he loved to adventure and be active. Annika was from the area and knew her husband would love doing what he enjoyed there. Anders loved being outside. From skiing, biking, hiking, rafting, fishing, and hunting, he is described as spending more time outside than inside. As the bear streaked toward him, parting brush and branches, it clearly drove itself toward a confrontation with the hunter. Anders began stumbling backwards, trying to increase the distance between him and the enraged bear. He struggled to pull his rifle from his shoulder, but his efforts were hindered by the interference from the brush. His mind raced for a solution as the reality of the situation ran through his mind. He was in a dangerous situation and could do nothing about it. The only thing he could do was brace for impact and desperately hope the attack would be brief. As the bear rapidly approached, Anders quickly untangled his rifle and managed to push it between the bear and himself. The rifle barrel grazed the bear's shoulder and did nothing to slow the bear's advance. He couldn't click off his safety and didn't even have time to put his finger in the trigger guard before the bear impacted him as he toppled to his back. The bear was on top of him before he could process it and put the 1,200 pounds of force per square inch bite force to use. It sank its teeth into his right arm and shook its head back and forth forcefully like a dog with a toy. It twisted its head as it shook, and Anders heard his arm bones pop under the force of the bear's jaws. The initial bite and the rending actions of the bear's jaws broke bones in his hand and his radius, as well as dislocated his shoulder and hand. It then clamped down on his left hand and bit quickly and repeatedly bit into it as well. The bear then focused its attack on his left leg, clenching his ankle in its jaws. Anders managed to kick the bear a few times, but it repeated its tossing motion on his ankle, pulling him downhill several feet in the process. Anders grasped, passing by bushes, in an attempt to avoid being dragged off by the bear. After it shook him about, it slipped its jaws down to his boot and bit through it with no problem. Its teeth narrowly missed severing a few of his toes by piercing his boot between them. Anders could feel his boot being pulled from his foot and recalled being oddly worried about losing it. He knew it may be pivotal in his escape and getting back to safety. The force and power of the attack on his ankle had ruptured his meniscus, torn ligaments and tendons, as well as broken his fibula. It tore open the flesh of his foot as well. As quickly as the attack had begun, it ended. The last thing Anders recalls is seeing a big furry rear end retreating into the brush to his relief. He immediately started yelling to his hunting partner, Hansen, to fire over the head of the bear to keep it going away. His hunting partner reported hearing nothing during the attack and being surprised at the condition of his partner when he arrived by his side. The hunters estimate the entire attack took only 15 to 30 seconds. Anders and his hunting partner were fortunate in that the location where the attack occurred received cell service. Anders asked Hansen to call Annika so he could speak with her. She expressed concern for the lack of experience Hansen had and wanted to make sure he didn't shoot her husband. After he spoke with her, the men tried to hike out. After assisting Anders to his feet, Hansen watched as his knee bent 90 degrees in the wrong direction after just a few steps. Knowing now that hiking out was impossible and could cause greater damage, they called 911. This phone call set in motion a chain of informational relays that notified a broad network of government agencies and allowed them to triangulate the hunter's exact location. The cavalry showed up with high-powered rifles and shotguns to the relief of Anders and his hunting partner. Annika called the Kalispell Regional Medical Center and inquired as to the staff on duty. She wanted to make sure her husband had had the best of care, as she worked as an emergency room nurse at the center. Brian Summers, a criminal investigator for Montana Fish and Wildlife and leader of the Wildlife Human Action Response Team, rushed toward the scene along with 3 game wardens who acted as security in case the bear returned to the attack scene. The investigative crew arrived as the medical team loaded Anders into the rescue copter, dispatched by 2 Bear Air. The investigative team combed the attack scene, searching for vital clues as to what led up to the attack. They photographed everything and measured distances between tracks left in the snow. They observed the imprints of Anders' backpack in the snow as the bear drove him into the snowbank. The team analyzed the bear bed for hair or saliva samples to use to identify the bear species or even the individual bear through DNA analysis. Anders was flown to the Kalispell Regional Medical Center where Dr. Joe Bergman, specialist in treating trauma and bear maulings, was waiting for him. Bergman observed bite marks all over Anders' arms, hands, and left leg, too many to count. Being aware that when bears bite, they pull up, causing deep tissue injuries, and inject saliva containing streptococcus, staphylococcus, pseudomonas, and clostridium bacteria, which can cause gas gangrene into wounds. Local medical facilities have concocted a mixture of antibiotics, which are immediately administered to counter such infections. The injuries may look superficial, but can actually be deep tissue wounds and lead to life-threatening infections. Anders received an IV drip containing those antibiotics to prevent serious infection as soon as he arrived at KRMC. They also removed debris from his wounds. Bite information was tediously collected and the information was passed on to the investigative team for analysis. Anders spent 7 days at KRMC before he was released to convalesce at home. He underwent a few months of physical rehabilitation before completely recovering. Summers and his investigative team tracked the bear, but eventually lost its trail as it continued out of the area. His samples and information were sent to a research center in British Columbia, Canada, for further analysis. There was no source that indicated that the bear was euthanized or identified after the attack. Anders is recovering and has recognized there was essentially nothing he could have done to avoid the confrontation. He does have plans to expand his supplies to include a space blanket as well as a satellite tracking device to be safer. He also notes that he willingly adventured into bear country and accepted the risks of doing so. He plans to continue hunting as well as his other outdoor activities and can't wait to get back outside, where he feels fulfilled. He encourages people to go outside and enjoy the risks and rewards the wilderness offers its visitors. After studying the facts surrounding this episode, I'm left with a few questions. Do you think bear spray would have prevented this attack? Do you think this bear should have been euthanized? What do you think Anders and Hansen could have done to avoid this attack? Why wasn't this bear denned up for hibernation? With local farmers and ranchers in the areas of high bear density indicating that they lose between 20 and 25% of their corn crop to foraging bears, and also report 20 to 30 cows per year being killed and fed upon by local bears seeking prey, do you think that bear populations are being pushed into human-occupied areas? I would love to read your comments, so please post them below.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode is called The Gruesome Bear Attack of Barry Gilbert. Today's episode takes place in the mountains of southwestern Montana near Yellowstone National Park at a location called Bighorn Pass. This area is remote and wild and a perfect home for bears and bear researchers. Barry Gilbert was a scientist. He was a field researcher who devoted his education and career to help the scientific community understand how brown bears are affected by human traffic through their remote areas. Barry was a faculty member at Utah State University and loved what he did. Near Yellowstone Park, Barry and a research assistant learned a very valuable lesson, but not what he was hoping to learn. The altitude was draining, but exhilarating as the research team crested the Bighorn Pass in the rugged southwest Montana area. It took nearly 6 days of hard hiking with their heavy backpacks through the still very wild and remote country they so enjoyed. After canoeing around a portion of Yellowstone Lake and nearly swamping themselves in the process, the duo was ready to accomplish their mission. The research team knew the risks and took significant precautions to avoid any problems with bears. They would camp off of the trails a good distance, as well as create physical barriers from branches and deadfalls to alert them to any curious animals, bear or otherwise. On the most notable day of their planned research, they came across a sow grizzly and her 3 healthy cubs. This is what they suffered for, and would be a great opportunity to do some research, gather data, and hope to learn how to best help the bear population. They watched as the cubs were threatened by a male bear, called a boar, and were impressed with the power and commitment of the mother bear to protect her cubs. She backed him down, and her and the cubs were on their way safely after the tense standoff. The next morning, Barry discussed circling around the bears and observing them from a viewpoint called Crowfoot Ridge. It would put the researchers much closer to the bears and allow them to gather more data. After a short hike, the scientists reached their observation point, but Barry had to urinate and walked a short distance into the bush to relieve himself. As Barry crested the top of the pass, the mother bear and her cubs crested it from the other side, in exactly the same place. Witnessing the prior day's tense standoff with the boar and the ultra-protective nature of mother bears, Barry knew this could be very bad. By the time Barry could process the situation, the sow let out a loud woof and blurred through the surrounding undergrowth that separated the pair. A mousy smear of motion and teeth, and the next thing Barry knew, he was on the ground. The sow was quick and efficient in her assault of the perceived threat. Barry felt the bear lock onto his head and could hear and feel the tissue of his scalp being torn away, but felt no immediate pain. The sow then savagely clamped down on Barry's cheekbones and crushed them, then pulled his cheekbone out, completely apart from his face. All Barry could think of was, "This is how you die." As his lifeblood poured onto the ground, his body fell limp. The perceived threat now neutralized, the bear let up on her attack. The graduate student accompanying Barry yelled and chased the bear from his research partner. A team of smoke jumpers were training nearby, and fortunately the helicopter pilot training with them was an experienced combat pilot who completed 2 tours in Vietnam. Adding to Barry's fortune, battlefield trauma surgeons were also in that same training session. If these trauma specialists had not been nearby, Barry would have certainly succumbed to his injuries very quickly. The surgery immediately after this attack saved his life and took 11 hours to complete and over 900 stitches and sutures. The hospital actually ran out of sutures due to his medical procedure. After the surgery, the surgeon showed Barry before pictures of his face and scalp. Barry asked the surgeon if he had ever seen this kind of damage before, and he said, "Yes, but not on one person." Barry's face was eventually rebuilt, but his left eye was blind, and he had a disfigured facial structure. Barry was not bitter or angry with the bear. She was merely defending her cubs from a possible threat. She was being a good mother, and he simply happened to be at the worst possible place at that time. If you would like to read his first-hand depiction of his attack and a lot more information, it is compiled in his memoir called One of Us, A Biologist's Walk Among Bears.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the North Fork of the Shoshone River, and yes, we have been here in prior episodes. It is just east of Yellowstone National Park boundaries on the Wyoming side. In the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, you may see plenty of mule deer, elk, and moose roaming the forests of pine, fir, spruce, and aspen. You might see a coyote flit through the sagebrush, or a wolf, cougar, or black bear with a recent kill if you are lucky. But of all the wonders of this area, let's hope you don't run in a grizzly bear like Tev Kelly did. On October 6, 2017, 32-year-old Tev Kelly was rifle hunting elk with his 34-year-old hunting partner, Scott Smith. They had been planning on this fall's elk hunt for some time and spent time brushing up on their skills by going to shooting ranges. They knew that success in elk hunting depends on shot placement in any conditions, no matter the wind, cold, or energy levels. Tev was an experienced hunter and professional hunting guide who enjoyed being as far back in the wilderness on his hunts as he could reasonably go. He was 6 feet 4 inches tall, but only weighed 150 pounds. He was lanky and wiry built, but the best hunters frequently are. They can get up the hills easier with their long legs and don't have to move a lot of weight either. Now, Tev had been charged by bears in the past. In fact, in 2016, he was charged 2 times that hunting season, on the same day. The year prior to that, Tev was also charged by a bear. For anyone who believes in the odds of any given occurrence, you might tend to believe that Tev's luck was about to run out. Well, not quite yet. Scott had actually drawn the controlled hunt tag for the hunting unit, and Tev decided to tag along for the fun. They rose before sunrise and departed camp on that Friday morning, hoping to find a bull elk of satisfactory size. Tev and Scott were glassing for elk on the day in question. If you've never hunted, that means that they were searching with binoculars or spotting scopes for animals located on adjacent ridges. This method of hunting gives the hunters a chance to see the animal they are pursuing and plan a route to stalk it. The men hiked the steep trails into the high country as the wind howled. They had continually located elk from afar, only to watch them slip away, further into higher and steeper elevations. As the wind forced the hunters into a slouching resistance, it also masked their scent from animals near them. Given the steepness of the terrain, they would appreciate any advantage they could gain. Now Tev didn't pack bear spray with him on hunts. He was simply unconvinced it would work in all situations, and given today was very windy, he was right on the money. Bear spray would have only been diluted in the gusts of 25 to 30 miles an hour, and he may have been completely defenseless afterward, with its contents being exhausted. The only thing apart from his rifle that he packed would be his 1911 .45 caliber super semi-automatic pistol. It has long been the favorite sidearm of many a military man for about 100 years, and is still the pinnacle in terms of power and performance. The pair managed to climb high enough that they had a great angle on a large bull elk. Scott leveled his rifle and took aim from 327 yards at the bull's right shoulder. With a slow squeeze of the trigger, the report of the rifle echoed down the valley as the bull tumbled and then rested down the hill a short distance. The men celebrated upon seeing the bull collapse, knowing their hard work had paid off with a successful harvest. It took a while, but they made their way to the carcass of the bull and knew that this was where the work begins. They placed their backpack and rifles uphill from the bull's carcass to prevent them from being bloodied during the gutting of the bull. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with hunting, gutting an animal is when you cut a large incision from the animal's throat area through its rib cage and abdomen and ending at its anus. Next, the windpipe is gripped and pulled from the animal's body. As the windpipe is pulled, it removes the animal's lungs and esophagus, which pulls the entrails of the gut along with it. By the time a hunter is done removing the guts of a large elk, the remaining carcass is usually quartered for easier packing and retrieval. Scott and Tev knew that the carcass weight of a bull elk would be at least 250 pounds if they removed the bones and took only the meat. That would be 2 trips to the carcass for each of them, and returning with about 60 pounds of meat for each man, each time. An alternative is to leave the bone in the quarter of the elk, which will take less time, as a quarter can be cut with a bone saw in only a few minutes. If each round trip took them 3 hours, they would have the head, hide, and meat out in the better part of a day. Spending time on the carcass cutting meat away from the bones would mean spending more time in the territory of a very smart and hungry predator. The approach to where the bull carcass was open and clear for 200 yards in each direction. The bull had died in an area similar to a small box canyon. The men had nowhere to go in the event of a problem. While the men gutted the bull elk, they discussed the need to suspend the rest of the carcass by rope from a tree. Even without the bones in the carcass, it would take them 2 trips to pack it out, and leaving the bones in the carcass would make roping it up into a tree easier and take less time. This is a common-sense practice many hunters use, as it makes it harder for bears to claim the meat as their own food cache. As the men were bent over the bull's carcass, an odd-sounding snap broke the silence behind them. They had just been looking around the carcass, planning everything out a few moments before, and hadn't seen anything alarming. Tev turned around to see what the source of the snap was, and that is when everything went into slow motion. He heard himself yelling, "Bear, bear, bear," and watched as a huge grizzly bear leapt over a deadfall log and bounded the short distance toward him and Scott. For some reason, each of the hunters moved in a different direction, confusing the bear momentarily. It paused for a second, as if it were deciding between the men who it would attack first. Tev took this brief pause to fire his pistol into a log, and the bear didn't flinch. Tev and Scott knew the bear had been completely aware of what it was running up on. With the cliff behind the men, they had no choice but to stand their ground and see if the grizzly charging them was bluffing. The grizzly immediately started sprinting toward the men once again. Tev could see every detail of the bear. It was fat, and the energy from each bound rippled through its body as it closed in on the men. Its head and ears were up to take in any information, and it stretched its paws forward with each bound, coming closer each time. As the bear neared the hunters, it stood up like a lineman in football. Given the bear was now a mere 20 yards away, Tev's next shot was not a warning shot. He aimed a little high on the bear as its head bobbed up and down with each bound toward them. He hoped to hit its head, but after firing his .45 was not positive where his bullet struck, but he knew he had hit the bear. Tev and Scott watched as the bear tumbled at the impact of the bullet. The grizzly rolled down the hill about 10 yards and lay still. Tev thought he had killed it, but after about 10 seconds it regained its feet. He was convinced it was about to renew its attack. He had witnessed how this bear had no fear of humans, and warily watched as the bear staggered in a circle. The grizzly was clearly stunned and severely injured, but still a very potent threat. As soon as it gained its bearings, they watched it stumble back into the forest. Right after firing the initial pistol shot and watching the bear tumble down the mountain, Tev and Scott ran for their rifles. They knew that the now wounded grizzly wouldn't tip his hat and forget about the meat or the men. Tev didn't fire again at the bear because he was unsure of exactly what the law said about killing a grizzly in self-defense. He, for some reason, was under the impression that once the bear was departing, he could no longer consider it a threat. Recent lawsuits and citations of hunters in similar situations blurred through his mind. In his hesitance, he granted a wounded and angry grizzly permission to threaten himself, his hunting partner, and anyone else who may have the misfortune of stumbling upon the bear. With the bear now out of sight, the hunters quickly loaded their first load of elk quarters onto their backs. Before departing, they attempted to hide the rest of the elk meat in a boulder cleft, thinking it may be safe there until they returned. They guessed their packs at about 100 pounds each, and for Tev that was quite a load. Scott weighed about 220 pounds, so he wasn't as burdened by the weight, but 150-pound Tev struggled to keep pace as the men made their way back toward their truck. The bear had left the scene in the same direction the hunters had to travel to return to their truck. The entire hike out was fraught with nerve-wracking glances and worried study of the trail ahead. They arrived at their truck at around 5 p.m. They immediately put the elk quarters they hauled out into the back of their truck and headed back toward Wapiti and the cell service they knew would allow them to call for help. Once in cell service, they reached out to the Wyoming Game and Fish Department and reported the incident to the authorities. Game Warden Travis Crane met at Tev's home to review the hunters' stories and decide their next steps. The next day, Tev and his father, Ned, as well as Scott, Game Warden Crane, and biologist Luke Ellsbury hiked back into where the hunters stashed the elk carcass. As they hiked, each of the men yelled and make as much noise as they reasonably could to make sure to avoid surprising any of the area's several grizzlies. As they neared the location, their hearts sank as they observed bear tracks from more than one bear, as well as scat all around the elk carcass. The meat was now missing, which indicated that a grizzly had claimed it and undoubtedly cached it nearby. They realized they were standing in the middle of a bear cache and knew a grizzly would not take kindly to this trespass. The grizzly that had initially charged the hunters was blonde in color. As they scanned the area, searching for the bear that was certainly laying up in watch over its cache, a darker grizzly caught their eye. It was about the same size as the blonde grizzly, estimated at about 400 pounds, but was clearly not the same bear. It didn't have any obvious wounds, which would be a clear indication of being the same bear. This grizzly was not happy to see the 5 men. It chuffed and woofed to let the men know it was there and that they had better leave. It stood in plain sight atop a deadfall pine tree to make sure they had seen it as it glared in their direction. Being very familiar with bears, the men all knew what was going to come next. If the bear didn't run away at the sight of the men, they knew they were in for a fight for their lives. As this darker grizzly charged the men, Ellsbury fired off 2 warning shots in the bear's direction. He was trying to scare the bear, but was concerned at its boldness. As the bear continually made its presence known, the hunters quickly pulled the remains of the elk carcass from the sticks and duff the bear had placed over it. They nervously tied the elk quarters to their backpacks, and the entire party fled the scene in a hurry. Upon arriving at the truck, Tev's hands wouldn't quit shaking as the intensity and danger of the situation overwhelmed him momentarily. He and his father made a video about the incident and posted it to social media to make sure hunters and hikers were aware of the incident. I could find no source indicating either man suffering from anxiety or nightmares following the incident. Wyoming game and fish officers formed a task group to search for the wounded grizzly, but all efforts came up fruitless. The wounded grizzly was never found. Despite being charged by grizzlies, sometimes multiple times in a single hunting season, Tev Kelly refused to let the incident keep him from doing what he loves. Before the week was up, he was out guiding another hunter on an elk hunt in prime grizzly territory. Regarding the incident of the grizzly and the elk hunters, Tev explains he has been within 100 yards of bears more than a dozen times, and he considers them enchanting. However, he does indicate they are less enchanting when they are trying to kill you. He also expressed sadness in knowing there is a wounded grizzly out there. Around the Cody, Wyoming area, grizzlies charging hunters is not uncommon, and incidents tend to peak during hunting season. In the state of Wyoming, there are said to be 600 grizzly bears, with the vast majority living in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem surrounding the park of the same name. Since the beginning of record-keeping regarding grizzly bear attacks in 1967, a total of 23 people have been killed in Montana and Wyoming. That is an average of 1 human death every 2 years due to grizzly bear attacks each year for the last 51 years. Since the year 2010, grizzlies have killed 8 people in Montana and Wyoming combined, with 7 of these fatalities occurring in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I am left with a few questions for you. Do you think this grizzly was a dinner bell bear that came in upon hearing the report of the hunting rifle? Could bear spray have prevented the injury to the bear? Were you surprised when another grizzly showed up and claimed the elk carcass? I will enjoy reading and replying to your thoughts, so post them in the comment section below, and let's talk about it.
Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider clicking on the like button and clicking on the bell icon. We'll help you know when we post our new episodes. Posting our video links to your social media profiles furthers awareness, and it's fun. We slashed our prices in our merch store, linked below, so check out the bargains there while you shop. As a member of our human community, remember to adventure bravely and be careful out there, especially in bear country.